We're settling back in for some more Bachelard, talking about the miniature. Our second example of valorized literary miniature will be a botanist's daydream. Botanists delight in the miniature of being exemplified by a flower, and they even ingenuously use words that correspond to things of ordinary size to describe the intimacy of flowers. The following description of the flower of the German stachys may be read under herbs in the Dictionnaire de Botanique Chrétienne, which is a large volume of the Nouvelle Encyclopédie Théologique, published in 1851. Quote, "These flowers, which are grown in cotton cradles, are pink and white in color, and small and delicate. I take off the little chalice by means of the web of long silk threads that covers it. The lower lip of the flower is straight and a bit folded under. It is a deep pink on the inside, and on the outside is covered with thick fur. The entire plant causes smarting when touched. It wears a typically northern costume with 4 little stamens that are like little yellow brushes." End quote. Thus far this account may pass for objective, but it soon becomes psychological, and gradually the description is accompanied by a daydream. Quote, "The 4 stamens stand erect and on excellent terms with one another in the sort of little niche formed by the lower lip, where they remain snug and warm in little padded casemates. The little pistil remains respectfully at their feet, but since it is very small, in order to speak to it, they, in turn, must bend their knees. These little women are very important, and those that appear to be the humblest often assume great authority in their homes. The 4 seeds remain at the bottom of the chalice, where they are grown, the way, in India, children swing in a hammock. Each stamen recognizes its own handiwork, and there can be no jealousy." End quote. Here our learned botanist has found wedded life in miniature, in a flower. He has felt the gentle warmth preserved by fur. He has seen the hammock that rocks the seed. From the harmony of the forms he has deduced the well-being of the home. Need one point out that, as in the Cyrano text, the gentle warmth of enclosed regions is the first indication of intimacy? This warm intimacy is the root of all images. Here, quite obviously, the images no longer correspond to any sort of reality. Under a magnifying glass we could probably recognize the little yellow brushes of the stamens. But no observer could see the slightest real feature that would justify the psychological images accumulated by the narrator in this dictionary of Christian botany. We are inclined to think that the narrator would have been more cautious had he had to describe an object with ordinary dimensions. But he entered into a miniature world, and right away images began to abound, then grow, then escape. Large issues from small, not through the logical law of a dialectics of contraries, but thanks to liberation from all obligations of dimensions. A liberation that is a special characteristic of the activity of the imagination. Under periwinkle, in this same dictionary of Christian botany, we find, "Reader, study the periwinkle in detail, and you will see how detail increases an object's stature." End quote. In 2 lines, this man with a magnifying glass expresses an important psychological law. He situates us at a sensitive point of objectivity, at the moment when we have to accept unnoticed detail and dominate it. The magnifying glass in this experience conditions an entry into the world. Here the man with the magnifying glass is not an old man still trying to read his newspaper in spite of eyes that are weary of looking. The man with the magnifying glass takes the world as though it were quite new to him. If he were to tell us of the discoveries he has made, he would furnish us with documents of pure phenomenology, in which discovery of the world or entry into the world would be more than just a worn-out word, more than a word that has become tarnished through over-frequent philosophical use. A philosopher often describes his entry into the world, his being in the world. using a familiar object as symbol. He will describe his ink bottle phenomenologically, and a paltry thing becomes the janitor of the wide world. The man with the magnifying glass, quite simply, bars the everyday world. He is a fresh eye before a new object. The botanist's magnifying glass is youth recaptured. It gives him back the enlarging gaze of a child. With this glass in his hand he returns to the garden, quote, where children see enlarged. Thus the minuscule, a narrow gate, opens up an entire world. The details of a thing can be the sign of a new world which, like all worlds, contains the attributes of greatness. Miniature is one of the refuges of greatness. Of course, in describing a phenomenology of the man with the magnifying glass, I was not thinking of the laboratory worker. A scientific worker has a discipline of objectivity that precludes all daydreams of the imagination. He has already seen what he observes in the microscope, and paradoxically, one might say that he never sees anything for the first time. In any case, the domain of scientific observation in the domain of scientific observation that is absolutely objective, the first time doesn't count. Observation, then, belongs in the domain of several times. In scientific work, we have first to digest our surprise psychologically. What scholars observe is well defined in a body of thoughts and experiments. It is not, then, on the level of problems of scientific experiment that I shall make my comments when we study the imagination. When we have forgotten all our habits of scientific objectivity, we look for the images of the first time. If we were to consult psychological documents in the history of science, since the objection may well be raised that in this history there is quite a store of first times, we should find that the first microscopic observations were legends about small objects, and when the object was endowed with life, legends of life. Indeed, one observer, still in the domain of naivete, saw human forms in spermatozoic animals. Here I am again, then, obliged to pose the problems of the imagination in terms of first time, which justifies my having chosen examples in realms of the most exaggerated fantasy. And by the way of a surprising variation on the theme of the man with the magnifying glass, I shall study a prose poem by André Pierre de Mandiargues, entitled The Egg in the Landscape. Like countless others, our poet is sitting, dreaming, at the window. But he discovers in the glass itself a slight deformation, which spreads deformation throughout the universe. Come near the window, Mandiargues tells his reader, while you force yourself not to allow your attention to be too much attracted by the out-of-doors, until you have seen one of these kernels that are like cysts in the glass, at times transparent little knuckle bones, but more often befogged or very vaguely translucent, and so long in shape that they make you think of the pupils of a cat's eyes. End quote. But what happens to the outside world when it is seen through this little glazed loon, this pupil of a cat's eye? Quote, does the nature of the world change, or is it real nature that triumphs over appearances? In any event, the experimental fact is that the introduction of the nucleus into the landscape sufficed to make it look limp. Walls, rocks, tree trunks, metal constructions lost all rigidity in the area surrounding the mobile nucleus. End quote. Here the poet makes images surge up on all sides. He presents us with an atom universe in the process of multiplication. Under his guidance, the dreamer can renew his own world merely by moving his face. From the miniature of the glass cyst, he can call forth an entire world, and oblige it to make the most unwanted contortions. The dreamer sends waves of unreality over what was formerly the real world. Quote, the outside world in its entirety is transformed into a milieu as malleable as could be desired by the presence of this single, hard, piercing object, this veritable philosophical ovum which the slightest twitch of my face sets moving all through space. End quote. Here the poet did not look far for his dream instrument, and yet with what art he nucleized the landscape, with what fantasy he conferred multiple curvature on space. This is really a fantasy on Riemann's curved space. Because every universe is enclosed in curves, every universe is concentrated in a nucleus, a spore, a dynamized center. And in this center, and this center is powerful because it is an imagined center. One step further into the world of images offered us by Pierre de Mandiargues, and we see the center that imagines. Then we can read the landscape in the glass nucleus. We no longer look at it while looking through it. The nucleizing nucleus is a world in itself. The miniature deploys to the dimensions of a universe. Once more, large is contained in small. To use a magnifying glass is to pay attention, but isn't paying attention already having a magnifying glass? Attention by itself is an enlarging glass. Elsewhere, Pierre de Mandiargues meditates upon the flower of the euphorbia. Quote, like the cross-cut of a flea under the lens of a microscope, the euphorbia has grown mysteriously under his over-attentive scrutiny. Oh, whoops. It was now a pentagonal fortress, looming stupendously high above him, in a desert of white rocks, and the pink spires of the 5 towers that studded the castle set in the front line of the flora on the arid countryside appeared inaccessible. End quote. A reasonable philosopher, and the species is not uncommon, will object, perhaps, that these documents are exaggerated, and that with words they make the large, even the immense, issue too gratuitously from the small. For him they are nothing but verbal prestidigitation, which is a poor thing compared to the feat of the real prestidigitator who makes an alarm clock come out of a thimble. I shall nevertheless defend literary prestidigitation. The prestidigitator's action amazes and amuses us, while that of the poet sets us to dreaming. I cannot live and relive what is done by the former, but the poet's creation is mine if only I like to daydream. This reasonable philosopher would excuse our images if they could be presented as the effect of a drug, such as mescaline. Then they would have physiological reality for him, and he could use them to elucidate his problems of the union of soul and body. I myself consider literary documents as realities of the imagination, pure products of the imagination. And why should the actions of the imagination not be as real as those of perception? Is there any reason, either, why these extreme images, which we should be unable to form ourselves, but which readers can receive sincerely from poets, should not be virtual drugs, if we must keep to this notion, that procure the seeds of daydreams for us? This virtual drug, moreover, possesses very pure efficacy. For with an exaggerated image we are sure to be in the direct line of an autonomous imagination.